The morning I saw him, the chrysanthemums fell from my hands. They fell because my body stopped working. Every muscle, every nerve, every breath I had been rationing across 7 years of widowhood, everything simply ceased. One moment, I was walking the familiar path between the rows of gray stone. And the next moment, I was standing completely still, with yellow flowers scattered across wet ground and my heart doing something I had no medical term for. He was standing 40 meters away, near the iron gate at the far edge of Mangyuri Cemetery. He was wearing a dark coat I had never seen before. His hair was silver, now, more silver than I remembered, more silver than I had imagined in the 1,000 quiet moments I had spent trying to picture what time would have done to him. If time had been allowed to do anything at all. His posture was slightly curved, the way a man curves when he has been carrying something invisible and very heavy for a very long time. He was not looking at me, he was looking at the ground. But I knew that neck, I knew those shoulders. I knew the way his hands hung at his sides, slightly open, fingers loose, like a man always ready to either receive something beautiful or release something painful. I had watched those hands across 30 years of mornings. I had held those hands at his mother's funeral, at the airport in Kisumu, in a hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning when the world outside was dark and the world inside was darker. I had touched his coffin with these same hands. I had pressed my face into the polished wood and screamed in a language that was not Korean and not quite Swahili either, some private language of grief that no one else in that cemetery understood. I had watched them lower him into Korean soil on a cold Tuesday in November. I had placed flowers on that ground every single day for 7 years, and now he was standing 40 meters away. And he was breathing. My name is Amina Odhiambo-Park. I was born in Kisumu, Kenya, on the western shore of Lake Victoria, where the water turns gold at sunset and your grandmother's voice carries further than any radio signal ever could. I am 61 years old. I have lived in Seoul for 33 years. I loved one man across all of that time, and I watched them lower his coffin into Korean soil 7 years ago. I built a life around that loss. I organized my grief into something survivable, something with daily rituals and careful boundaries. And then one Tuesday morning in November, everything I had built fell apart at the seams, because the man I buried was standing 40 meters away. And the story of how we arrived at that moment, that is the story I need to tell you, from the beginning. Because you cannot understand any of what followed unless you first understand what we were to each other when we were young. When the world had not yet decided to test the full measure of what we were made of. I came to Seoul in the early 90s. I was 28 years old, fresh out of university with a business degree, and working for a small import-export company in Itaewon, the part of Seoul where foreigners gathered, because none of us fully belonged anywhere else. Korea felt restless back then, loud construction, fast growth, everyone moving like time was chasing them. I remember stepping off the plane and thinking, this city never exhales. I was afraid too. But my mother raised me to carry fear quietly. I met Yiwon on a cold Thursday evening during my 2nd year in Seoul. I had stopped at a small pajangmatcha tent stall after work. My Korean was terrible back then. I could survive a subway ride, order food badly, and apologize when necessary. That night, I pointed at the wrong dish. The woman running the stall looked confused. Before I could embarrass myself further, the man across from me spoke in careful English. She's saying that has fish paste. Do you eat fish paste? I said I didn't know. He smiled slightly and pushed his own plate toward me. Try this instead. That was Park Yiwon. He was quiet, well-dressed, and carried himself like a man who noticed danger before other people noticed weather. At the time, I thought he worked in finance. Years later, I learned the money he managed belonged to the Afro-Korean crime family. But that night, he was simply kind. We sat there talking for almost 2 hours. His English sounded formal, almost old-fashioned. He apologized whenever he couldn't find the perfect word. It should have made him seem distant, but somehow it made him warmer. We started meeting every week after that. He showed me hidden corners of Seoul. I taught him stories about Kisumu and Lake Victoria. He listened the way very few people do, fully, patiently, like every memory mattered. One evening, I told him my family name, Odhiambo. He repeated it carefully and said, "It sounds like sunset." I laughed and told him that was an unusually poetic thing to say to a woman he barely knew. He answered, then perhaps I should wait a year before saying it again. We married 2 years later. The ceremony in Seoul was small and quiet. But when we traveled to Kenya afterward, my mother welcomed him like he had always belonged there. I still remember him standing in our yard near Lake Victoria wearing a blue chiton shirt my mother made for him. My family laughing around him, the evening sun behind him. For the first time since meeting him, he looked completely at peace, like a man who had finally arrived home. He cried quietly at the airport when we left Kenya. He thought I didn't notice. But I always noticed everything about him. That was the gift and the burden of loving Park Yi-won. I need to tell you about the organization before I can tell you what it did to us. The crime family was called Hukryong, the Black Dragon. I did not learn that name until years into our marriage. At first, I only noticed the shape of the life around it. The late-night phone calls, the careful men who visited our apartment. The heaviness Yi-won sometimes carried home with him like invisible rain. Yi-won managed money for the organization. Real money, hidden money, the kind that never appears in honest records. He was brilliant at it, precise, patient, calm under pressure. But it was not a life he chose freely. His father had served the organization before him, and Yi-won inherited that world the same way some sons inherit farms or family stores. He believed there was no escape from it. He was wrong. His older brother, Park Ti-won, was one of the family's senior enforcers, sharp, ambitious, and deeply resentful. The leadership trusted Yi-won more. They believed he was smarter, more disciplined, better suited to eventually control the family's financial operations. Ti-won never forgave that. And over time, his resentment toward Yi-won became resentment toward me. The Park family did not approve of me because I was African, because I was black. In their world, a mafia wife was expected to stay silent, stay invisible, and never challenge tradition. I failed every one of those expectations. At family gatherings, Ti-won treated me like furniture. Conversations moved around me instead of through me. His wife, Sunmi, copied his behavior, though I always sensed fear behind her silence. Over time, I learned what it feels like to sit in a crowded room and slowly disappear. But Yi-won's mother was different. Park Soon-hee barely spoke to me during our marriage, but 1 month before she died, she called me to her hospital bed. She looked weak then, fragile, but her eyes were sharp. She studied me quietly before saying, in slow Korean, "He loves you in a way that frightens me. I do not understand it, but I believe it." Those were the last words she ever spoke to me. And for many years afterward, I carried them like proof that even in the coldest places, truth eventually reveals itself. About 2 years before he died, though I did not know then that dying was approaching, Yi-won came home very late on a Thursday night. He said nothing unusual. He ate the food I had kept warm. He asked about my day. I had been teaching English at a small private language institute in our neighborhood, which I had done for nearly 12 years by that point. And he always listened to everything I told him about my students with genuine interest, the way he listened to everything I said. As though my world was as worthy of his full attention as any boardroom or backroom negotiation, he had been part of that day. He listened, and then he looked at his hands and he said, very quietly, "Amina, if something happens to me, you leave Korea. You go back to Kisumu. You do not stay here. You do not ask questions. You go." I told him nothing was going to happen to him. He said, "Of course not." He smiled. He went to bed. I lay beside him in the dark for a very long time, listening to him breathe, feeling that something had shifted in the atmospheric pressure of our life together. The way the air changes before a very large storm that is still too far away to see, but close enough to feel in your bones. In the specific way that old injuries feel rain coming before anyone has seen a cloud. That warning was the last real conversation we had about anything dangerous. Several months later, on a cold morning in November, Park Yi-won was found dead in his car in the basement parking structure of a building in Gangnam. The official cause was cardiac arrest. He was 57 years old. The autopsy was conducted quickly. The funeral was arranged entirely by the family. I was informed about every detail rather than consulted on any of them. He was buried at Manguri Cemetery on a cold Tuesday. I stood at the graveside in my black mourning clothes, a combination of Korean black and a strip of fabric from Kisumu that my sister had sent me, wrapped at my wrist. Because grief belongs to the body, and the body always knows where it came from. I was the only person present who was not Korean. I stood in the cold, and I looked at the coffin, and I said goodbye to the person I had loved most in any world I had ever inhabited. The thing that troubled me, and I say troubled, but I mean it the way a crack troubles a wall, quietly and with long-term consequence, was T1's face. I have been to many funerals in my life. In Kisumu, funerals are enormous and communal, and raw. People wail and sing and fall down because grief is not polite in my community. It is expressed loudly because suppressed grief curdles into something much worse. Korean funerals are different, more contained. But grief is still visible in a Korean face if you know where to look for it. T1 did not look grief-stricken. He looked relieved, not happy, not cruel, simply relieved. The way a man looks when a problem he has been managing carefully for a very long time has finally, in some way he did not quite plan, but perhaps half hoped for, resolved itself. And Sunmi, standing beside him, looked at me once during the ceremony. Just once. Her eyes held something I could not name that day. I named it later, in the quiet of the years that followed. The word I finally found for it was sorry. I visited his grave every day for 7 years, not every week, every single day. Rain, snow, summer heat, it did not matter. I took the subway to Manguri Cemetery every morning carrying chrysanthemums, sometimes white, sometimes yellow, sometimes pale pink. They had been his mother's favorite flowers, and I spoke to him. I know how that sounds, a lonely widow talking to a gravestone, but I was not speaking to a stone. I was speaking to 30 years of marriage. To shared mornings, quiet arguments, familiar silence, and the kind of love built slowly over decades. I refused to let that become silence simply because death had interrupted one side of the conversation. I told him about my students, about my sister's children in Kisumu, about the old restaurant near our apartment finally closing down. I told him how Seoul kept changing faster than I could keep up with, and on difficult mornings, I told him I was still here. The first strange thing happened during the 3rd year. One April morning, I arrived to find the flowers rearranged, not scattered by wind, carefully arranged, deliberately aligned. Someone had touched them. I said nothing to anyone. The second strange thing happened 8 months later. I arrived before sunrise on the anniversary of his death and noticed fresh footprints near the grave, larger than mine, fresh enough that frost still clung to the edges. Someone had been there before me. For the first time in years, hope entered my grief again, and hope can be a cruel thing. I told myself it was a groundskeeper, a security worker. Anyone except the possibility my heart wanted most, but the feeling stayed with me. Then came the third strange thing, a man. I first noticed him on a Wednesday morning sitting on a bench near the veteran section. Gray jacket, newspaper, cap pulled low, but the bench faced my husband's grave, not the memorial behind him. The next Wednesday, he returned, then again the week after that. One Wednesday he disappeared, and I felt an emptiness that embarrassed me. The following week he came back. This continued for months. Then one morning, I finally walked toward him. When he saw me approaching, he stood immediately. The newspaper slipped from his lap. Without saying a word, he turned and hurried toward the eastern gate. By the time I reached the path, he was gone. And for the first time in 7 years, my grief began changing into something far more frightening. Hope. It was deep into the 6th year when a young man came to my door. He was perhaps 25. Korean. He had the specific nervousness of someone sent to do something they are profoundly uncertain about. He stood at my door with an envelope visible inside his jacket, and he spoke quickly, not quite meeting my eyes. I worked for someone who asked me to make sure you were well. He said to give this only if you seemed in danger. I said, in danger of what? He said he had not been told. He said I seemed well. He was already reaching back into his jacket for the envelope, already retreating from the decision of giving it to me. He said he was sorry to have disturbed me. I said in the voice my mother used when she had finished being patient, "Son, give me the envelope." He gave me the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper. And on it, in handwriting I recognized before I had consciously processed what I was seeing, that careful, precise handwriting. The penmanship of a man taught by a strict teacher and never permitted to forget it, were 8 words. 4 in Korean, 4 in English. The Korean said, "Ka dungsinu enus, ka hungsung enus, ka satung enus." I love you always. The English said, "The grave has no floor." I returned to the cemetery before dawn the next morning. I brought a flashlight, a small garden tool, and told no one where I was going. A cemetery before sunrise feels different. Every sound becomes larger. The trees seem wrong somehow. Even your footsteps sound guilty. I found his grave without needing the flashlight. After 7 years, my body knew the path better than my mind did. I knelt beside the headstone. For years, I had touched this stone with grieving hands, pressed my forehead against it, spoken to it like it could answer back, but I had never thought to press beneath it. I slid the garden tool into the seam near the base and pushed. The headstone moved. Underneath was a waterproof metal box. My hands shook as I pulled it free. Inside were photographs, notebooks, official documents, and a mobile phone sealed in plastic with a note attached in his handwriting. "Charge this first." I carried everything home pressed tightly against my chest. At my kitchen table, I sat staring at the box for a long time before touching anything again. My body already understood that my life was about to change. While the phone charged, I opened the documents. They contained years of secrets, bribes, hidden accounts, murders disguised as accidents. Names of police officers and prosecutors I recognized from television. Then I reached the section about Yiwon. Official cause of death, cardiac arrest. Actual cause, murder, ordered by one man. Park Tae-won, his own brother. I sat there staring at the page while my entire understanding of the last 7 years collapsed inside me. Every flower, every prayer, every morning at that grave. All of it suddenly felt different. And beneath the grief came a terrifying question. If Yiwon had truly been murdered, then whose body had they buried? I looked at the phone. 40% charged. I turned it on. There was only one contact saved. Amina, my name. I called. The phone rang 4 times, then a voice answered. "You opened the box." 7 years older, slower, but unmistakably his. For a long moment, I could not breathe. I could not speak. And he waited quietly, the same way he always had whenever my emotions arrived before my words. Finally, I spoke in Daluo, the language of my childhood. "Idhai kawer ango. Where have you been?" There was silence. Then he answered in the careful Daluo I had taught him over 30 years of marriage. "Idhai kawerang jima nai. I have been protecting your life. We met in person that evening, not at the cemetery." He gave me an address. An ordinary apartment building in the far north of the city, in a quiet neighborhood that the Hukryong family's Gangnam operations had no reason to pay attention to. He told me the floor and unit number. He said, "Come after dark. Come alone, leave your regular phone at home." I did all of those things. He opened the door before I could knock. He had been watching through the peephole. He had always been a man who watched from a position of preparation, who arranged the space around himself carefully, who liked to know what was coming before it arrived. 7 years of hiding had not changed this. If anything, it had refined it. He looked like himself, and he looked like a stranger, and he looked like the truest version of himself, the one that existed only in the space between the two of us, visible to no one else. He was thinner. The silver was complete now, no remnants of the dark hair I had run my hands through across 30 years of ordinary nights. There were new lines on his face, and some of those lines came from a specific pain, the sustained pain of concealment, of living inside a false identity, of being alive in a city where being recognized would end everything. He looked at me, the way a man looks when he has been rehearsing a moment for years, and the reality of it is simultaneously smaller and infinitely larger than any rehearsal could contain. I walked past him into the apartment without touching him. I sat down at the small table near the window. I folded my hands. I looked at him standing in the middle of his small hidden life. This man I had married and buried and spoken to every morning for 7 years. And I said, in Korean, in the voice I use when I have moved past fear into something quieter and more absolute, tell me everything. From the beginning, do not spare me. I am 61 years old and I have already survived the worst thing I could imagine. Nothing you say will break me. He sat across from me. He placed his hands on the table, open, fingers loose. That gesture, that same gesture I had seen 10,000 times and had not seen in 7 years, and the sight of it physically hurt. The way you feel pain in something you believed was gone. He told me everything. He had known, for 2 full years before his arranged death, that T1 intended to kill him. The records he had been collecting, the confession document in the metal box, were his leverage, his attempt to hold T1's plans in suspension. But T1 had grown impatient and had found a way around the leverage by moving faster than Yi-won had anticipated. 8 months before he disappeared, Yi-won had been approached by a prosecutor named Lee Jae-yeon, who was leading a long investigation into the Hugh-Kryong family. She had found him carefully. She had presented him with something he had not expected. Not safety, not comfort, not any kind of easy outcome, but a way to survive, and more importantly, a way to ensure that I survived too. Because T1's plan was not only to kill Yi-won, he paused here, he looked at the table. And then he looked at me with the expression of a man, delivering the thing he has been least able to forgive himself for knowing, the thing that drove every decision that followed. If Yi-won simply disappeared with the evidence, T1's next logical move was to eliminate the vulnerability that remained. The foreign wife. The woman who might know things, who was not Korean, who had no protection from the family's obligations and no allies within its structure. I was, in T1's calculations, a loose end. Yi-won had known this, he had known it for months. And his solution, the only solution he could find that would satisfy both Prosecutor Lee's requirements and T1's need to believe the threat was eliminated, was to die convincingly. To surrender the evidence to the prosecution under a formal protection arrangement, to disappear into a new identity, and to leave behind a wife who was grieving sincerely. Sincerely. He said this word with a weight that acknowledged everything it cost, because a sincerely grieving widow was the safest version of me he could arrange. A wife who knew her husband was alive, who might slip once, one phone call, one moment of visible hope at the wrong time. One tear that looked like relief instead of grief, that wife was a wife in danger. He had made this decision without consulting me. He had decided, alone, what I could survive. He had weighed my grief against my life and chosen my life and not told me he was doing it. I said, you let me grieve for 7 years. He said, yes, I said, I talked to your grave every single day, I brought flowers. He said very quietly, I know, I came to listen sometimes. When it was safe enough to be near. And then I understood the man in the gray jacket on the bench, who had stood and walked quickly away the moment I moved toward him. Because of course he had walked away. He could not let me see his face. Not then. Because T1's network had still been watching, and a widow who suddenly recognized her dead husband in a cemetery would have ended both of us. I said, when did it become safe? When did the danger to me pass? He was quiet for a moment, then he said, several years ago. After T1 was arrested and his network had been largely dismantled. I said, several years ago. He said, yes, I said, and you waited even longer to make contact. He said, I waited because I did not know if you would want, after everything. Amina, I did not know if I still had the right to walk back into a life I had destroyed. I did not know if what remained of what we had was enough to ask anything of. The room was very quiet. Outside, Seoul moved through its evening, traffic and voices, and the sound of someone's television through a thin wall, all of it completely ordinary. All of it completely impossible to reconcile with the fact that I was sitting across from a ghost who had chosen to haunt me from a living distance, rather than let me know he was breathing. I said, you did not have the right to make that decision for me. You did not have the right to erase 7 years of my life to protect me without asking me whether that was the protection I wanted. He said, I know, I said, I am angry. I am deeply, completely, thoroughly angry. He said, I know, I said. I am also the only person in this room, possibly in this entire city, who understands exactly why you did it. And I hate that I understand it. I hate that I can see your logic and your love inside the same terrible decision. He said nothing. Outside, the sounds of the city continued. Someone laughed in the apartment above us. A bus passed on the street below. I said, Yi-won. He looked up. I said, I still bring chrysanthemums every day. He said, I know, I am sorry. For all of it, for every morning. I said, what happened to T1? He said, arrested, convicted, Seongdong prison, 7 counts including the arrangement of deaths. He paused. The evidence from the box was central to the prosecution, I said, and the physician who administered the compound, he said, also convicted. I sat with that. Justice is a complicated thing. It does not return what was taken. It does not give back 7 years of mornings, or 30 years of growing old together, or a mother who died in Kisumu in 2019 without seeing her daughter's husband alive again. It is not restoration. It is only the closing of a particular kind of wound. The scar remains. Then he said, in the careful old-fashioned English he had used when we sat across from each other at a small tent stall 30 years ago on a Thursday evening in October. He finds it rather extraordinary that you are sitting across from him. He would very much like, if you are willing, to sit across from you for whatever time remains. He is aware this is a very great deal to ask. He intends to ask it anyway. I looked at him for a long time. I looked at his open hands on the table, at the silver hair. At the new lines that grief and hiding had drawn on a face I had memorized completely, and was now memorizing again. The way you memorize a landscape you thought you had lost, and are suddenly standing inside of once more. I said, I am not answering tonight. He said, I understand. I stood up, I put on my coat. I walked to the door and I opened it, and I stood in the doorway for a moment with the hallway light behind me, and I said, without turning around, 7:30 tomorrow morning. The bench near the veterans section, I heard him breathe. I walked out into the Seoul night, and I went home, and I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by photographs, and I was not at peace, and I was not broken, and I was not certain of anything except that I was alive, and he was alive, and the chrysanthemums were still yellow on a grave above an empty box. And somewhere in all of that, there was a shape I had not yet found the name for. He was there at 7. I arrived at 7:30 exactly, and he was already on the bench, sitting with his hands open in his lap, looking at the grave, at the headstone with his name on it. At the yellow chrysanthemums I had left there the morning before. He was looking at his own grave the way a person looks at a version of themselves they have been forced to inhabit and are only now, slowly, beginning to set aside. I sat beside him. We did not speak for a long time. The cemetery was quiet in the early morning, that particular quality of stillness that belongs to places designated for remembering, where the ordinary noise of the city seems to understand that it is not welcome and falls back accordingly. The November light was thin and pale, coming sideways through the trees, the kind of light that does not warm you but illuminates everything with a kind of precise, unsentimental honesty. After a long while he said, very quietly, I did not know if you would come. I said, I come here every day. I did not change my routine on your account. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost, I said, I went to see a friend last night. She told me to follow what my body wanted to do. He said, what did your body want? I said, it wanted to come back. He was very still. I said, but I have conditions. He said, tell me. I told him, every one of them, clearly and without apology. Truth from this point forward, every dangerous thing, every uncertain thing, everything he would previously have decided I did not need to know. He would tell me, even when it frightened him. Especially then, he would come to Kisumu with me. He would stand in my mother's yard. She was gone now, she died while he was hiding. While I was grieving a man who was alive. And he would stand in her yard and explain himself to my sister and my family in whatever words he could find. And he would understand that I had built a life in his absence that was mine, that some parts of it would remain mine, and he would accept this without condition or complaint. He said yes to everyone. Then we sat in silence for a while longer, on a bench in Manguri Cemetery in the November morning. Two people in their 60s who had loved each other across 30 years, and a mafia empire, and a brother's murderous ambition, and 7 years of flowers laid on empty ground. After a while I said, "The bench faces the wrong direction. It faces the grave instead of the veteran memorial." He said, "I chose this bench specifically." I said, "I know you did." He reached out and placed his hand on the bench between us, open. Fingers loose, waiting, not reaching for me. Just placing his hand in the space between us and leaving it there, available, unhurried, the way he had always offered things, without pressure, without demand. With only the quiet confidence of a man who believed that what was real between two people did not require forcing. I looked at his hand for a moment, then I placed mine beside it, not holding, just beside, two hands on a wooden bench in a cemetery on a November morning. The first time our hands had occupied the same space in 7 years, it was enough. For that morning, it was entirely enough. We went to Kisumu in the spring. My sister, Achieng, met us at the airport with an expression I recognized immediately. The expression of a woman who has been given a story she does not entirely believe, but has decided to accept. Because the alternative is losing her sister back to grief, and that alternative is unacceptable. She looked at Yiwon for a long moment. Then she handed him 3 pieces of luggage and said, in English, "You can carry these." She walked ahead without looking back. He carried everything without complaint or comment. I believe he would have carried the entire airport if she had asked. He understood, in that instinctive way, he had always understood the language of family, even when the words were unfamiliar. That being given something heavy to carry was not a punishment. It was a test of character, and he had enough left to pass it. We stood in my mother's yard on the second afternoon. The lake was visible from the compound, a silver line at the edge of the landscape, the same silver it has always been. Indifferent to everything that has happened on its shores and determined to be beautiful regardless. The jacaranda tree my mother planted when I was born was enormous now, purple and extravagant, and entirely unconcerned with the passage of decades. Yiwon stood in that yard and looked the way he had looked 30 years earlier in the chiton shirt my mother had sewn. Except that 30 years had been through him, and he carried them visibly. In his silver hair and his curved posture, and the specific expression of a man who has spent years being grateful for something he is only now, finally, in the right place to be grateful for properly. He said, in the Daluo I had taught him word by word across 30 years, "Ai bido kain." I am grateful to be here. Achieng looked at him, then she looked at me. Then she went inside and came back with 2 cups of tea, handed one to each of us, and sat down in our mother's chair in the yard, and began talking about her youngest son's school examinations as though nothing extraordinary had occurred at all. Which is the Kisumu way of saying, "You are home, you are forgiven, we are not going to make a ceremony of it. Sit down and drink your tea. I still go to Manguri Cemetery, not every day now. Perhaps twice a week. Old habits soften, but they do not disappear, and grief does not disappear either. It changes shape, it becomes something you carry differently, with different muscles, but it does not leave you. I have come to believe this is correct. Grief should not leave us entirely. It is the record of what mattered. It is how we know, with absolute certainty, what we loved. Yiwon comes with me sometimes. We sit on the bench near the veteran section. We do not always speak. We have spent so many years not sharing the same silence that we have become slightly greedy for it now, this specific silence. The silence of 2 people sitting close enough to feel the warmth of each other and not needing to fill the air between them with anything. His name is still on the headstone, we have not changed it. There is something true about leaving it, an acknowledgement that the man who was buried here was a real version of him, that the years of hiding and grief and separation were real. That we cannot simply erase them and return to who we were. We are not who we were, we are who we became across all of it. That is a different thing, and in some ways a more honest thing, and I have decided to make my peace with that. He is 68 now. I am 61. We are both slower, both quieter, both carrying the specific fatigue of people who have survived things they were not certain they could survive. My knees still complain about the cold. He still overfills his thermos. Some things change and some things, apparently, are simply the shape of a person. My mother used to say, in Daluo, that love is not something you find. It is something you recognize, like a path walked before, even in a place you have never been. You look at it and your feet say, yes, this way. I recognized Yiwon at a pajangmatcha on a Thursday evening in October, 33 years ago. Across 30 years of marriage, and a crime family's inheritance, and a brother's long resentment, and a prosecutor's cold bargain, and 7 years of chrysanthemums laid on empty ground, across all of it, I never stopped recognizing him. That is not a fairy tale. There are things he did that cost me years I cannot recover. There is a version of grief that lives in me permanently, the grief of the woman who spoke to a headstone every morning and was never answered, and that version of me deserves to be honored. Not erased. But I am 61 years old, and I am sitting on a bench in a cemetery on a Tuesday morning in November, and the man beside me is drinking coffee from an overfilled thermos. And the chrysanthemums are yellow today because yellow felt right, and the city beyond the cemetery walls is doing what it has always done, breathing in, endlessly, hungrily. Always reaching for the next version of itself. And for this moment, in this light, with his open hand beside mine on the wooden bench, I find that I am not afraid of any of it. Not the past, not the years ahead. Not the love that refused, across every test and every year of distance and every morning at a grave above an empty box, to have the decency to die. He looks over at me. He says in that careful old-fashioned English that still, after all these years, makes me want to smile, "You are thinking something." I say, "I am always thinking something," he says. "Tell me." I look at the grave with his name on it. At the yellow chrysanthemums. At the path my feet have worn across years of devotion to a loss that turned out to be, in its strangest and most painful form, a love protecting itself by any means it could find. I say, "I think we should go home." He stands, he holds out his hand, open, fingers loose. Ready to receive or to release, the way he has always been. The way he was at a pajangmatcha on a Thursday evening when he slid his plate across a counter toward a stranger. And changed the entire direction of her life. I take it. We walk through Mangyuri Cemetery in the November morning light. An old Kenyan woman and an old Korean man with silver hair, and a second chance neither of them fully deserved, and both of them intend to keep, and the chrysanthemums remain where I left them. Yellow against gray stone, evidence that someone was here, that someone came every single day, that love, even when it appears to have been buried, has a way of insisting on the surface. It always finds its way to the surface. It always does. For my mother, who taught me that grief is not the opposite of love, they are the same river. Moving in different directions, finding each other again at the sea. Thank you for listening to this story. If it meant something to you, there's more like it here. You're always welcome to come back for more.